Hi, I'm anxious to talk to you today about what is probably one of the downsides of IT and all of what we've gotten involved with in IT, including social media and organizations that leverage it to compete, and that's cybersecurity. As you know, you probably read about this in the paper every day, that some company has been breached and that some of your records and your data might have fallen in bad hands. Well, in organizations, there's a lot of work done to try to prevent this. And while we read about the headlines, in the headlines of the ones that it didn't go so well, there are a lot of other examples where things have been prevented. And it's not just related to technical solutions that can ward off cyber criminals. There's a lot of things that individuals can do, and so companies have comprehensive training programs that deal with those issues. Maybe you've been through one yourself. So today we'll go through some of these issues related to cybersecurity and update you on some of the best methods and some of the current situations that have arisen that we're still learning from. I think some of the most recent breaches have been pretty egregious. The size of the breaches are just astounding, and that has to do with the scale and the network effects that are being achieved in these big platform markets that these companies are competing in. So one example is Facebook, and recently 50 million users were compromised there. This was the loophole was found in the View As button. And that button lets users visit their profile at some of their friends or public audience. So it lets that visitor seem like it's a friend or like a public audience, but it isn't really. So that breach really was pervasive. It even affected the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and the chief operating officer, Sheryl Sandberg. So I think it's pretty obvious that they weren't prepared for this and were very upset by it, especially because it was a feature they added that they thought would be valuable to the people on Facebook. Another big example of a large company that was hacked was Google+. And Google identified there was a vulnerability in their software. It was in an area called an application program interface. You'll see that abbreviated API. And that API gave third-party app developers access to data from the friends of the app users. Google made it worse because they kept the compromised data a secret for quite a while. So the parent company of Google, Alphabet, decided that it would shut down Google+ for the good of everybody. So that's a pretty drastic reaction, and I think it's an attempt to protect a brand from a new service that was offered. And that's what I mean about cybersecurity having the potential to be a real impediment to organizations as they try to compete using information technology. Another example is British Airways, and this was kind of a different one because in this case, British Airways transactions were impacted. So people who had basically booked flights and things like that, their personal and their financial data was stolen. They said that the passport and flight details were safe, but so that's some solace in that situation. But overall, the data that was stolen was unsafe for 2 weeks while the company's websites were under attack. So what does that mean they were under attack? These cyber criminals were putting in probes to the different points of the networks and the databases of British Airways and trying to find these vulnerabilities and pull out what they could from the databases. So when companies are under attack, they have to figure out how to counter that attack. So counter cybersecurity specialists will work on different types of things to capture the people that are coming in and try to shut off the breaches that are occurring. Another example is T-Mobile. In this case, around 2 million US customers had their account details breached. The bad folks got names, email IDs, account numbers, billing details, and they got encrypted passwords. All those were stolen. Now, a lot of this data after it's stolen ends up for sale somewhere on the web to other bad parties. So oftentimes it's the hackers who steal it, and then others who take advantage of that data to try to create even more mayhem. Another example is FIFA. So those of you who are into soccer and the sports industry surrounding FIFA, well, around 3.4 terabytes of data was taken and about 70 million documents got breached. And much of that stolen data was leaked to a German newspaper named Der Spiegel. And that company said the leaker wanted to bring to light the major corruption in sports. And maybe you saw the headlines related to what was discovered in that data. I think this is an example of something we'll refer to later called hacktivism. It's not clear that that data, once leaked, got out to other bad people, but the intent may have been a bit different in this case than in some of the other cases that we've discussed. So those are just some of the major recent security breaches, and the amount and the impact of those breaches is just astounding. What are the motivations then for some of these attacks? Like why would I want to go in and steal a company's data? And I mentioned earlier that one of those, there's this notion called hacktivism, and others are extortion. So for example, some computers are being locked up by hackers, and they request ransoms in order to unlock those computers, and maybe even full systems. And companies are asked to pay those ransoms in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency, and it has low trackability for how people gain it and can expend it. So that's kind of an ideal type of currency to be exchanged for this ransomware. It's a really important crime that all of our governments are trying to address across the globe, but extortion is certainly one of the reasons. Another reason is espionage. So espionage is one country, going after another country, trying to gather some data to maybe be able to exploit that data for competitive reasons and even cyber warfare reasons. So espionage, some think that the latest Marriott breach might be espionage related. So you can look that up and read a little bit more about that Marriott breach. And I also just mentioned cyber warfare. In that particular motivation, lots of times botnets are used, and those botnets just go attack a website and a company's information systems and try to tie them up so that nothing else can happen on those systems. And that's called a denial of service attack. There are other types of attacks there. One is called man-in-the-middle attack, and that's where someone inserts themselves between a real user and the actual company's systems and is able to kind of hijack that connection as a person in the middle. The last one under cyber warfare that you typically see is called cryptojacking, and this is actually where people can try to steal the bitcoins or extort the transaction dollars as they move through a network. Another motivation is, of course, terrorism. And in this example, I think probably one of the top three criminals was a British citizen. His name was Junaid Hussain, and he became the number 3 leader of ISIS. And he was a most wanted terrorist due to his hacking, and just had major mayhem to a lot of companies' information systems. There were also pranksters. So some of these folks who feel like they're pulling a prank or a joke that conduct an attack. And an example of that is a couple of people that worked with President Trump's cabinet for some time, not recently, Steve Bannon and Anthony Scaramucci. They were both once employees of President Trump's White House. They were pranked through an email imposter. So that type of thing happens as well. I mentioned hacktivism before. A group that you might want to check out to learn more about some of their motives is Anonymous. This kind of crosses that ethical boundary while trying to maybe accomplish something good, but it may not, in my mind, it's not the best way to go about it. Another motivation attack is revenge. So there's a recent U.S. law that's being considered. It's called the Active Cyber Defense Security Act, and that will make revenge hacking illegal. The last one I'll mention for a motivation for attacks is intellectual property theft. And one example here is even the Game of Thrones show was leaked online after it was breached, and then hackers were able to steal the video files. So those are some of the motivations for attacks.